Welcome to the Hagee Hotline for January the 31st, 2017. I'm Matt Hagee, and with just over a week in office, President Trump has set the tone for his administration and accomplished what many elected officials failed to do. He's actually keeping some of his promises that he's made to the American people. And on today's program, we're going to visit with several guests who will shed light on what President Trump's most recent executive orders mean for the United States. We'll also be discussing the frontrunners for the Supreme Court justice and explore the complicated and often tumultuous relationship between America and China. But first, let's check in with Trey Ware and find out more about today's headlines.
Thank you, Matt. Well, first up is President Donald Trump fired his acting Attorney General Sally Yates last night. Ms. Yates had said she could not defend and would not allow the Department of Justice to defend his new immigration ban from those 7 countries. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Gunmen have attacked a mosque in Quebec, Canada. Many have died from this. There is one in custody. Full details coming up. And finally, is the Chinese army preparing for war? Just what are they up to? We'll talk about this and more a little bit later on in the show. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Trey. We'll see you at the end for a wrap-up. On Friday, President Trump signed an executive order temporarily suspending the refugee program and banning travel to the U.S. for citizens from 7 terror hotspots. Here to discuss this action and the topic is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Jasser, welcome back to the Hagee Hotline. How are you today?
It's great to be with you, Pastor. Thanks for having me back.
So what do you make of the response that we're seeing to President Trump's executive order regarding this immigration policy?
Well, the response from the identity left is predictable. I mean, even President Obama hasn't wasted any time to doing his knee-jerk reflexive exploitation of Muslims for an identity purpose, when in fact there's nothing about Muslims in the ban. It is a ban against 7 countries, which his administration, the Obama administration, had named as the hotspots. So those countries were simply stopped. It's a pause. It's not an abandonment of immigration. It's simply a pause to revisit how we keep our country safe, because so far we have had 8 years, if not even more, into the Bush administration of a policy that simply countered a tactic, terrorism, that countered extremism. It did not counter the ideology of jihadism, of Islamism. And President Trump is following through on his promises and saying, hold on, let's take a breath. This is not anti-Muslim. This is about the protection of minorities, about the protection of American principles. And, you know, the left said, oh, he was singling out Christians. That's not true. He's singling out minorities that are persecuted. It's very American to protect religious freedom abroad. That would include Christians, Yazidis, Muslims like myself who are dissidents that protest abroad and are persecuted. So this is not, you know, they're trying to make it into a Muslim issue. You know, the George Soros movements and foundations are exploiting this and funding rallies and other things. And they're trying to rip us apart when, in fact, this is about security and American freedom.
And I think it's important that you point out a reality that most people might not be aware of. President Bush is the president that began to want to make sure that we were taking careful steps to see who was entering the country. President Obama continued that in a more lenient way. And President Trump has not gone as drastic as the Bush administration, yet he's not as lax as the Obama administration. He's kind of landed in the middle. However, the response has been as if this is something that in almost a dictatorial fashion he just edicted. He has not done anything of the sort. He's just continued what past presidents have done. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the bottom line is he couldn't give too much warning, because then the radicals would flee and use the 30-day warning to go. So he had to do this quickly. But on the other hand, you know, I think the messaging could have been better. The implementation at the airports on the borders could have been better. But, you know, this is a new administration, and we need to work with them to keep us secure. And by the way, 56 countries are Muslim majority. He only identified 7. I would have added Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Pakistan. Those are cauldrons of radical Islam that clearly are the founding fathers of ISIS. But I think this is the beginning of a conversation. America needs to take a deep breath and realize that this is about, I mean, there is nothing, Pastor, more pro-Muslim than defending those Muslims who are fighting with us against jihadists, against theocrats. We need to begin, just as in the Cold War, we had policies against communists. We didn't let them in if they didn't share our values. but yet we brought in many refugees. Similarly, now we can bring in many refugees from Muslim majority countries that are Muslim, Christian, Yazidi, but they need to share our values. And that's what this administration will begin to do, I hope.
Well, and as you mentioned, other nations, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, I know that the headlines in the news are carrying several diplomats from Indonesia and other parts of the world that have claimed that President Trump's position is dangerous because the jihadists will use it as propaganda. Can I ask you, what won't they use as propaganda? I mean, if he does something, they're going to make it propaganda. If he does nothing, they're going to make it propaganda. So is that even a legitimate argument?
It's not only illegitimate. The fact is that our weakness on the battlefield, our weakness and appeasement that the Obama administration has been doing has been their greatest tool, where the Islamists were guiding American policy, allowing the Saudis and the Qataris to radicalize the Syrian population, put their billions of petro-Islamic dollars into the mix there, and that has been what has given them fuel. So us simply saying that we're going to begin to take the side of Muslims that believe in our same values is actually the reason they're getting upset. Is who's getting upset? The old establishment, I call them the Islamic mafia of the world, these governments that are theocracies, they're the ones getting upset. You have Iran putting out a letter telling us about freedom when in fact they are the open air prison of the planet. And they are the ones who've taken in 0 refugees and are fueling the genocide in Syria with their work with Assad. So when you have Saudi Arabia that's taken in no refugees, that is giving us lectures about what we're going to do to fuel radicalism, you realize that they're the ones who have at stake the fact that Islamic theocracy's days are numbered if America really gets into the ideological battle.
And as you mentioned, the days of Islamic idealism in terms of jihadism being numbered, a lot of the work that you have dedicated yourself to is building bridges for people to develop understanding between peaceful Muslims and individuals who want to live a life of freedom and faith, and how that correlates with what America is all about. How do you see President Trump's policy? Does it make America safer, or is it going to lead to other things?
Well, I think the inability to identify the problem that we've seen in the last 8 years has actually created more division in America. So when you engage, and as the president has said in his campaign, he wants to create immediately a commission on radical Islamism. And I would wholeheartedly support that. We have many Muslims in our Muslim reform movement that would be willing and ready to participate in that, because that would then allow Americans to say, oh, wait a minute. Islam is not divided into either they're just our friends or everyone's a possible terrorist. There are reformists who share our values that we need to engage. So by identifying jihadism, Caliphism, the Islamic State, Sharia state as the threat, Americans will then become more educated and understand that there's a battle within the House of Islam to create societies that are free, no different than the founding fathers in America fought against theocracy, but yet were very Christian and believed in very Judeo-Christian values. We Muslims can go through that same reform. And I think it's important that all people who believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights work together. And that's what our Muslim reform movement does. And I think the Trump administration will evolve into that policy to create this commission and begin to actually make clear what it is we stand not only against, but for.
Dr. Jasser, thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for taking the time to join us today on Hagee Hotline. Always great to see you. Look forward to seeing you again.
Anytime. Thank you, Pastor.
Coming up, we're going to be discussing the frontrunners for the Supreme Court Justice. This evening is a big announcement, and America is going to indeed want to hear. Also, we'll be looking at a growing feud with a major nation in Asia, obviously the biggest of the big, China. All this and more when we return.
This is with regard to the construction of the Keystone Pipeline. This is with respect to the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. This week we'll be announcing, next week we have outstanding candidates, and we will pick a truly great Supreme Court justice. Secondly, I'm establishing new vetting measures to keep radical Islamic terrorists out of the United States of America. We don't want them here.
Webster's dictionary defines revolution as a sudden or complete change. The fact is, America needs a revolution if she's going to survive. We want you to join us in Branson, Missouri for a Righteous Revolution, April 27th and 28th, featuring music by Canton Junction, the Hagees, the Cornerstone Church Choir, and more, with teaching by Pastors John and Matt Hagee and Diana Hagee. Call the number on the screen or go to jhm.org.
As we enter the new year, many of us face what lies ahead with uncertainty. But in God's Word, we can find the answers to every situation we'll ever face. For a gift of any amount to John Hagee Ministries, we'd like to send you a free copy of Pastor John Hagee's sermon series, The Book of Answers. And for a gift of $75 or more, we'll send you the Book of Answers, along with a copy of the New King James Version, the Devotional Daily Bible. To give your tax-deductible gift, call the toll-free number on your screen or go to jhm.org/answers.
Welcome back to the Hagee Hotline. Here to discuss the frontrunners for Supreme Court Justice is Carrie Severino, Chief Counsel and Policy Director for the Judicial Crisis Network. Carrie, welcome to the Hagee Hotline. How are you today?
Good morning. Great to be here.
You know, the drama's building. President Trump, without a doubt, is an individual who knows how to capture attention, and he's talked about nominees, and obviously he's got an announcement to make this evening. What do you see happening tonight, and what will be the response from the American people when they hear who the next nominee for the Supreme Court is?
Well, President Trump has made it very clear through his whole campaign how focused he is on replacing Justice Scalia with someone who is able to carry on that legacy. So to that end, he had really the political stroke of genius of putting out this list of Supreme Court candidates, all of whom would have been excellent replacements for Scalia, people who have that same philosophy of faithfulness to the law, faithfulness to the Constitution. And now it seems like we're down to the last few on this list, and we'll find out who it is. All of them have such excellent credentials, long records on the federal bench, and particularly, which is most important, long records of understanding the same kind of philosophy that Justice Scalia had. We need to look at the text of our laws that was signed by the president. We need to look at the Constitution in its own text and not try to import political views in there. Let's just interpret the law as it is.
So with these three candidates all being qualified in their own right based on the decisions they've made and their values, what they've demonstrated they respect for the Constitution, is there one that you see standing out above the others that would be the best fit for, let's just say, the conservative movement, if that's an accurate term?
I don't have a favorite at this point. I'm excited about all of them. I think it's kind of like being on the Harvard admissions committee. You got all these kids with 4.0s and 1,600 SATs, and maybe one of them's a musician and one of them's a scientist. They've all got different flavors. So you've got someone like Neil Gorsuch, who has this amazing academic record, some great decisions on religious freedom and separation of powers and the Constitution there. You've got Bill Pryor, who also has an amazing religious freedom decisions, has made some very bold comments about Roe versus Wade, and is known to be able to stand up for his conservative principles. And then Judge Hardiman on the Third Circuit, he has a great record of incredible public service and volunteerism, pro bono work in the Hispanic community, as well as some impressive decisions on the Second Amendment. So, any of them would be a great pick. I think we're just excited to find out tonight who it is.
Now, with regard, they're all individually qualified. They've all had, obviously, rulings that are made over the course, their cases that are presented to them. But when it comes to the Supreme Court, there's other justices. When these kinds of decisions are made, does the administration sit down and think, okay, who might get along best with those who are in there, or do they simply look at the individual for who they are and the decisions that they would make? Do they think about the social fit in any regard, or is it simply just the law?
Well, there's obviously a lot of interpersonal play, but I think the most important thing is having someone who can stick by their principles, because you don't want someone who's going to compromise the right answer in a case in the hopes of maybe gaining votes in a later case. That's kind of politics that maybe makes sense in the Senate, maybe makes sense in the House of Representatives. It's not what the Supreme Court is there to do. At the end of the day, however, really, when we're replacing Justice Scalia with another person in the mold of Justice Scalia, we're going to see the court return to the balance that it had last year at this time. So 4 solid liberal votes, 4 mostly solid conservative votes, hopefully, and then Justice Kennedy, who is the swing vote. So for this time, it does depend on someone being able to win the vote of Justice Kennedy. That's something that I think Kennedy has more to do with than this nominee, however.
And as you're talking about, the Supreme Court and its function and its purpose, with absolute clarity, you've stated it clearly. However, recently the Supreme Court has kind of started to drift from that and get involved more in public opinion. We have, Justice Ginsburg making statements against President Trump. Do you see her in any way recusing herself from decisions or being disqualified from being, objective when it comes to the issues that are going to be before the court?
Yeah, she definitely made some very inappropriate statements during the campaign. I think if there had been another Bush v. Gore style case where there was the justices had to make a decision on which the election itself might have turned, you absolutely should have seen her recuse herself in that kind of situation. Thankfully, the election results were clear. We know who the president is. We didn't have to ask the Supreme Court. And I don't think she'll probably be recusing herself going forward. But if she continues to talk that freely and that candidly to the media, that kind of issue may come up again. We'll have to wait and see.
And so with this president, obviously everything he says, everything he does, every action he takes, whether normal or more aggressive, it's going to meet a lot of resistance, as we've seen around the airports based on his current immigration policy. What do you think is going to happen with this nominee? Is he going to be quickly confirmed? Is he going to be strongly contested? How's it going to play out whenever it comes to his confirmation?
Well, with the people we're looking at now, Judge Pryor did have some pushback during his confirmation hearings to the appellate courts, but Judges Hardiman and Gorsuch, they were confirmed unanimously. And so I think some of the Senate Democrats are going to have a hard time if they want to push back against these people. You're going to have them saying, this is someone I voted for, but I'm not going to vote for them now. And what's worse than that, they're not even talking about just voting against these people. You've got Chuck Schumer, the minority leader, saying he wants to block this space basically for 4 to 8 years until he gets someone he likes in the White House. That's not how the system works. President Obama's first 2 nominees, they were confirmed by the Senate. They didn't get filibustered by the Republicans. I hope we'll see more Democrats taking a reasonable, fair line in this, unlike Schumer's politicization. I think he's going to try to put up a big fight. That said, there's certainly the votes. Any of these people is so obviously qualified. They'll be confirmed. I just hope that the Senate is able to push through the obstructionism that Chuck Schumer is telegraphing that he's going to have and get this person on the court. They could be hearing cases at this term already, and that would be so important to avoid having 4-4 splits that are unnecessary. We need that deciding vote.
Well, Carrie, it's certainly an exciting day to watch what happens in the Supreme Court. I know that you've got a lot of analysis and information. Thank you for sharing that with us, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon here on the Hagee Hotline.
Great. Good talking to you.
Throughout his campaign, now Mr. President Trump has spoken about China, and he's mentioned that the relationships between the two countries will no longer be simply business as usual. But what does that mean for these two nations? Are we headed for a collision? Here to share his expertise on this subject is Gordon Chang, attorney, Asia expert, and author of The Coming Collapse of China. Mr. Chang, welcome to the Hagee Hotline. How are you today?
I'm very fine, thank you, and thank you so much.
A lot of people, they hear about China, but they might not really be aware of how China works as a government and what their influence is in regards to the United States economy. How will President Trump's policies really affect the relationship with China, and how does that impact the United States?
I think the one thing that we're going to see is more tension in the relationship. And, people sort of moan about that. But the important thing is we got to remember that President Obama and President Bush before him glossed over some very important issues, didn't deal with them. And because of that, we've got ourselves in a very unfortunate position where all of the outcomes going forward are pretty horrible. So, the important thing, I think, is that Trump is probably going to deal with these things that we have glossed over for, the last 16 years.
So we've had 2 presidents that really just kind of made a mess of a relationship that President Trump has now got to work to, in essence, clean up. And whenever he gets the stains of their mess on his hands, are individuals going to claim that it was his fault, or are they going to see it objectively through the lens of history?
Well, I think many people are going to say, look, under Presidents Bush and Obama, we had a calm, cooperative relationship with Beijing, and now we don't. And so they're going to blame Trump, of course, for this. But we got to remember that both of his predecessors, they tried to engage China and sort of bring it into the international system. And because of that, they were unwilling in most cases to confront China when it was engaged in unacceptable behavior. So, for instance, we have China's seizure of Scarborough Shoal in early 2012 from the Philippines, an act of aggression. We have cyber theft somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $500 billion a year of U.S. intellectual property. You know, the list just goes on and on. And what we have seen in the previous two administrations really has not been an attempt to deal with these in a substantive way. So I'm happy that Trump is going to deal with these in a much more realistic manner.
And you mentioned Beijing. You know, China has a lot of issues with, you know, their history, how they view their position in terms of Asia and where they sit in really world government. Whenever President Trump recently reached out to Taiwan, how did that affect Beijing? What was their feel about President Trump's call to their providence as they see it in Taiwan?
I think they were taken aback. We got to remember that if you go back to March during the campaign, Beijing sort of switched. They really wanted Trump to win because he was talking about withdrawing from Japan and South Korea. And so they expected him to be much more cooperative with Beijing, and that's why they effectively supported him. I think that they were really surprised by the December 2 phone call between Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen and President-elect Trump, because what it showed was that he is willing to change diplomatic convention. You know, since 1979, there have been no high-level contacts, and certainly that phone call did break that streak. So I think Beijing was surprised, and they've been surprised by some of the other things that he's done since then. So right now, I believe that at least the civilian diplomats are really sort of in disarray. They don't know how to deal with him, and they're just sort of quietly feeling their way, hoping that they can come to some sort of arrangement like they had with prior American presidents.
So a lot of folks, they hear about China, they might not be aware of China. What is it that led you to speak out about China?
Well, you know, we lived in China for quite some time, from 1996 to 2001. And when we first arrived, you know, we sort of said, as I can remember my wife mentioning to her mother on the phone, she said, "Mom, China's not communist anymore." And I agreed with her. But as we lived there, as we worked there, traveled around the country, we saw that the system really was not changed. I mean, there, of course, were these magnificent hotels and buildings and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, the system itself really was the same going back to the founding of the People's Republic. And we're starting to see that now under Xi Jinping, who has openly talked about his admiration for Mao Zedong and how it's very important for the Communist Party not to deny its roots. And so we are seeing a lot of regression in almost all phases. Its diplomacy, its economy, all the rest of it. You know, human rights has really been a disaster. And so these are things which I think are an indication of the system itself. And we have yet to confront that. You know, Ronald Reagan understood the nature of the Soviet system. We do not understand the nature of the Chinese system.
Well, and it's through that understanding that we identify the things we need to work on. And hopefully the United States and its citizens will get behind the president's effort to clean up a mess that has been brewing for quite some time. Dr. Chang, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate your efforts and look forward to visiting with you about this important topic again.
Well, thank you.
As President Trump puts into action measures that he believes will make America great again, we're going to take a look at the forces that some say will divide us.
Of us take an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. What the President has done is not in the interest of security.
Here to join us, as always, is our good friend Trey. Trey, we've talked about quite a lot on this program, but what do you think about what you just saw? How do those protests really impact the United States, and what do they matter at the end of the day?
Well, they matter because they believe that they are causing a revolution here. They call themselves revolutionaries, and this is what revolutionaries do. They create chaos in the streets as they try to overthrow the government. And there are certain factions in that group right there, in the Women's March from a couple of Saturdays ago as well, that believe that they're going to bring about a revolutionary concept in the United States. Nancy Pelosi, what she just said there, right there, was not true. What has happened with this ban from these 7 specific nations is not unconstitutional. The Constitution and the Congress, Matt, have put the power to decide who comes into the country and when they come into the country with the president. And that means he or she, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever, that power is with the president. That's a constitutional move. And Sally Yates, the acting attorney general and Obama appointee, found that out last night when he had to fire her for not defending that measure.
And you mentioned her firing. I think it's kind of interesting that immediately the conversation says, well, it's the Saturday night massacre of Watergate. And what a ridiculous notion that an individual who was tasked with a job, who didn't do her job, gets dismissed from her job, relates to anything that has to do with one of the greatest presidential controversies in American history. It's something that should speak quite loudly to objective people when they hear these kinds of things as extremism whenever the president does his job. When you don't keep your responsibility to the American people and the president keeps his, one of you has to go, and he decided it was her.
Well, you had a giant organization. If somebody walks in and says, I'm not going to do my job, and you can forget about it, well, you've got a choice to make. Do you allow them to stay there and not do their job, or do you let them go and find somebody who will do that job? Donald Trump says, I need somebody who will do the job. Now, that's all going to be a moot point. This was her playing to the left-wing base out there. She knew that her time was very, very short. She's going to be replaced by Jeff Sessions in a day or two. Sometime this week, he will be approved. In fact, the vote at the Judiciary Committee is going on right now. Then it'll go to the full Senate. So he should be approved for the AG spot. This is all politics, all window dressing. All they're trying to do is satisfy a left-wing base that is very, very mad and can't get over the election of Donald Trump. It's something that we're going to live with, I think, or I fear, for the next 4 or 8 years. Whatever he does is going to be protested by this faction.
Well, and you bring up a very good point. Her time was short. Literally, she would have gone down as just a moment in history of transition. And now she's made herself a name and will eventually show up in the future in some way as a martyr, either for an oppressed female who has faced the fury of a very hostile man, or she's going to be the poster child for a movement of some kind. It's something that I think people should put an asterisk by, because when she shows up again, they should recognize this was the moment that she got her 15 minutes and then leveraged that into her future. The reality of it is the president put his hand on a Bible. He said, I'm going to do the job of protecting American citizens from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And as the gatekeeper of the country, he has now decided that we're going to pay a little more attention to those who come through the gate. I think it's interesting that we lock our doors at night, that we set our security alarms, and that's not an issue against immigration, it's an issue against violation. We simply don't want people who would violate our personal property to have open access to our homes, to our lives. And now we have a president who is simply applying the same principle when it comes to watching the front door of the United States. You know, Trey, you mentioned that it's important that the president do his job. I think it's also important that the United States citizens do our job, that we become actively involved in helping the president solve these problems, because it's not only going to take a lot of effort and courage on his part, but it's going to take a lot of personal responsibility on our part. As a matter of fact, a great leader from a previous century, Winston Churchill, said that responsibility is the price of greatness. Trey, here's to making America great again. Thanks for being on the Hagee Hotline.
God bless you, Matt. Thank you.